There is a population that crossed into the most hostile environment on Earth not once, but at least 3 times, and for decades, scientists believed they knew exactly how that story unfolded. Then the genome opened, and the timeline did not just shift, it fractured. For nearly a century, the Arctic was treated as one of the simplest migration stories in human history. A single people, the story went, crossed from Siberia into the New World, adapted to the ice, and became the Inuit we know today. Clean, linear, settled, except it wasn't. Because buried in frozen soil, in centuries-old teeth and fragments of bone, researchers found something that did not belong to one story. They found evidence of at least 3 separate migrations across the same narrow strait of water, populations crossing, vanishing, and crossing again, thousands of years apart. And one of those populations, when its DNA was finally read, turned out to carry a genetic signature so strange that one of the scientists involved said he could not remember any other case quite like it. This is the story of how a simple Arctic origin became one of the most genetically complicated migration puzzles in North America, and how the people who survived the most extreme environment on the planet may have inherited that survival from a population that should not have made it at all. For most of the 20th century, the accepted history of Arctic peoples was built primarily on archaeology, stone tools, harpoon styles, house structures, and the layered remains of ancient hunting camps scattered from Siberia to Greenland. Archaeologists identified distinct cultural traditions in the order they appeared in the sediment. First, the Paleo-Eskimo cultures, often called Sakak or pre-Dorset, then the Dorset culture, and finally the Thule culture, the direct ancestors, researchers believed, of the modern Inuit. The standard narrative was straightforward. Around 5,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers crossed from Siberia into Alaska and spread eastward across the Canadian Arctic, eventually reaching Greenland. These were the Paleo-Eskimos. Centuries later, a new culture emerged, the Thule, better equipped with toggling harpoons and umiak boats, who expanded rapidly across the same territory. Archaeologists assumed continuity. One group evolved into the next, or one group simply replaced the other in a fairly conventional cultural succession. Distinctions were drawn between the different cultural units in the Arctic in the period up to the rise of the Thule culture, which replaced all previous Arctic cultures and is the source of today's Inuit in Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. Science Daily. It was a tidy framework. Tools evolved, technology improved, people succeeded one another the way layers build a mountain. For decades, that was enough. But archaeology can only tell you what people made. It cannot tell you with certainty who those people actually were, or whether the ones who disappeared from the record actually disappeared from the bloodline. The first cracks came from something archaeology alone could never fully resolve: the question of continuity. Did the Paleo-Eskimo population simply transform into the Thule culture, the ancestors of the Inuit? Or were they 2 entirely separate peoples, one replacing the other, with no biological connection at all? Tool styles can be borrowed, technologies can spread between groups without any exchange of people, a toggling harpoon does not prove a bloodline, and the deeper archaeologists looked, the more the Paleo-Eskimo and Thule traditions seemed less like a smooth evolution and more like an abrupt cultural rupture. Different house structures, different hunting strategies, different material cultures appearing almost overnight in the archaeological record. Something had changed in the Arctic. The question was whether the people had changed too, or just their tools. This is where genetics entered the story, and where the simple version of Arctic prehistory began to come apart. Researchers turned first to mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, generation after generation, almost unchanged except for the slow accumulation of mutations over time. Because it mutates at a fairly predictable rate, mitochondrial DNA functions almost like a genetic clock, allowing scientists to estimate how closely related populations are and roughly when their lineages diverged. Later, researchers expanded into Y chromosome DNA, tracing the paternal line, and eventually into autosomal whole genome data, the full genetic blueprint inherited from both parents, capable of revealing far more complex patterns of mixture, migration, and ancestry than either maternal or paternal lines could show alone. When the team led by evolutionary geneticist Eski Willerslev and molecular biologist Maanasa Raghavan applied these tools to ancient Arctic remains in a landmark study published in Science, the results did something the archaeological record alone never could. They separated the people from their tools. And what the DNA revealed was not continuity. It was isolation extreme, almost unbelievable isolation. The earliest inhabitants of the Canadian Arctic, the Paleo-Eskimos, appeared to have lived in isolation from their neighbors for nearly 4,000 years, without mixing with Native Americans to the south or with the ancestors of the modern Inuit. National Geographic. Willerslev's own reaction captured just how unusual this was. He noted that everywhere else in the world, as soon as different human groups encounter each other, they have children together, even, in some cases, entirely different human species. 4,000 years of genetic silence, in a region where multiple peoples were clearly moving through the same territory, was almost without precedent. National Geographic. If you enjoy this kind of science-driven history, where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, consider subscribing. There is far more hidden in the human past than most people realize. That isolation alone would have been a remarkable finding, but the genome had more to reveal. When researchers examined the diversity within that maternal DNA, the mitochondrial signal carried by the earliest Paleo-Eskimo migrants, they found something almost impossibly narrow. The genetic diversity was so low that it raised the possibility the founding population included only a small handful of women, perhaps, in the most extreme interpretation, as few as one. National Geographic. One woman, possibly. The evidence does not prove this outright. Researchers describe it as a signal pointing toward an extraordinarily severe founder effect. The genetic narrowing that happens when a population descends from a very small number of original ancestors. But the scale of that narrowing was, in Willerslev's words, unlike anything else he had encountered in population genetics. That was not a contradiction of the old story. It was something stranger. A population that crossed into one of the most lethal environments on the planet, carrying almost no genetic diversity to begin with, and somehow persisted there alone for 4 millennia. And then it vanished from the archaeological record entirely. About 800 years ago, the ancestors of the present-day Inuit and Yupik people replaced this population across the Arctic, and by roughly 700 years ago, the archaeological evidence for the Paleo-Eskimo culture had disappeared. Mint. Replaced, not merged, not absorbed, replaced according to the genetic data available at the time. The Paleo-Eskimos appeared to be a genetic dead end, an entire lineage, isolated for 4,000 years that simply ended. For years, this became the accepted picture. 3 migration waves into the Arctic, early Native American ancestors, Paleo-Eskimos, and finally the Thule ancestors of the Inuit, moving through the same frozen corridor in sequence, with the middle wave leaving no genetic descendants at all. But the story did not end there, because newer research, working with larger sample sizes and broader comparative genome panels across Siberia and North America, began finding something the earlier studies had missed. There are several ways scientists have tried to make sense of what the genome was actually showing. One framework treats the Paleo-Eskimos as a true genetic dead end, a population whose DNA simply does not survive in any group alive today, fully consistent with the original extreme isolation, total replacement model. A second framework proposes a more layered admixture event, that as Paleo-Eskimo populations encountered incoming Thule ancestors and unrelated subarctic groups, limited interbreeding occurred at the edges of their range, leaving a faint, almost undetectable genetic trace easy to miss with smaller data sets, but still present. A third framework, the most disruptive of the 3, suggests something closer to a hidden inheritance, that Paleo-Eskimo ancestry did not vanish, but persisted broadly, not necessarily through the people who became the Inuit, but through other populations entirely, ones nobody initially thought to compare. The newest large-scale genomic research increasingly points toward that third possibility. In a more recent study generating genome-wide data from a wide range of ancient and modern Arctic and subarctic samples, researchers found that a substantial proportion of the genetic heritage of all ancient and modern American Arctic and Chukotkan populations actually comes from the Paleo-Eskimos, including groups speaking Eskimo-Aleut languages, like the Yupik, Inuit, and Aleut, but also, strikingly, populations speaking entirely unrelated Na-Dene languages, such as the Athabaskan and Tlingit peoples of Alaska, Canada, and the northwestern United States. Mint, that detail should stop you. Na-Dene speakers were never supposed to be part of this story. Their languages are not related to Eskimo-Aleut languages at all. They were considered, linguistically and culturally, an entirely separate branch of Native American history. But the genome did not seem to know the difference. Researchers found that shortly after Paleo-Eskimos arrived in Alaska, between roughly 5,000 and 4,000 years ago, they interbred with populations carrying ancestry similar to more southern native peoples, and the ancestors of both Aleutian Islanders and Athabascans appear to derive significant heritage directly from that ancient mixture. Mint. Not a dead end, a hidden root system spreading further and into stranger places than anyone expected. This finding directly contradicted the earlier conclusion. It stood in contrast to previous genetic studies that had suggested the Paleo-Eskimos were an isolated people who simply vanished after roughly 4,000 years. One of the senior researchers involved, geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School, described it as the resolution of a years-long scientific disagreement, stating that the new findings supported the idea that Paleo-Eskimos had in fact spread Na-Dene languages, not simply genes. Smithsonian Magazine. That is not a small revision. That reframes an entire linguistic family's origin story around a population once believed to have left nothing behind. The twist is not that there was mixing in the Arctic. Mixing happens almost everywhere humans meet. The twist is where the signal pointed into language families and population groups that, for decades, no one thought to connect to the Paleo-Eskimo story at all. And the migration count kept climbing. Further genomic analysis suggested the ancestors of the Inuit and Yupik themselves did not simply walk into the Arctic once. The evidence indicates their ancestors crossed the Bering Strait at least 3 separate times, first as the early Paleo-Eskimo migration into Alaska, then as a return migration back toward Chukotka in Siberia. Generations later, and during that extended stay in Siberia, likely lasting more than 1,000 years, Yupik and Inuit ancestors mixed with local Chukotkan groups before a third crossing brought their descendants back into the American Arctic, eventually becoming the Thule expansion that archaeologists had long credited as the singular origin of the modern Inuit. Mint. Cross. Mix. Cross again. Mix again. Cross a third time. The Bering Strait was not a one-way bridge walked once in deep prehistory. For the ancestors of the Inuit, it was closer to a corridor, used, abandoned, and used again across thousands of years by people who kept absorbing new ancestry each time they passed through. What looked, in the textbooks, like a single clean migration into the New World was, in the genome, beginning to look like a relay passed across an ocean strait by different hands, over and over, until almost no version of the one people, one journey story could survive contact with the data. It helps here to imagine the place itself. Picture the Bering Strait in winter, not a boundary, but a frozen plain wind, scouring the surface into ridges of blue-white ice. The dark water beneath, rarely more than 50 miles away in either direction. For people on foot, it would not have looked like the edge of the world. It would have looked like flat, walkable ground, no different from the tundra they had already crossed for generations. There was no fence here, No sense of arrival or departure, only ice, wind, and the slow accumulation of footsteps moving in both directions, season after season, century after century, leaving almost nothing behind except, millennia later, fragments of bone cold enough to preserve a signal that language and tool styles never could. That signal is still being read, and it is forcing a rethinking of something larger than one Arctic culture. This is the part of the story that matters beyond the Arctic itself. The pattern researchers have uncovered here: isolation that turns out to be partial, replacement that turns out to be incomplete, populations declared genetic dead ends that resurface generations later in groups nobody thought to test, is not unique to the Inuit. It shows up again and again wherever ancient DNA meets a tidy historical narrative. Human history was never linear. It was never a single line moving cleanly from origin to present. It was a network frayed, doubling back on itself, absorbing fragments of populations that archaeology alone declared extinct. The old maps, built from tools and pottery and house structures, could only show what people built. They could never fully show who people were, or which threads of ancestry survived quietly inside groups no one expected to be connected. The Inuit story, as it stands now, is not a story of one people arriving and adapting. It is a story of at least 3 migrations, multiple admixture events, an extraordinarily narrow founding population whose maternal lineage may have traced back to almost no one, and a so-called vanished culture whose genetic legacy turned out to be quietly distributed across language families that, on paper, share nothing in common. Researchers remain cautious about exactly how much Paleo-Eskimo ancestry persists in any single modern population, and the work of comparing ancient genomes across Siberia and North America continues. This is not a closed case. It is an active, ongoing reconstruction, one still capable of surprising the people doing the reconstructing. But what is already clear is enough to upend the old textbook version. The people who survived 4,000 years of isolation in one of the harshest environments humans have ever inhabited did not simply disappear when their culture vanished from the archaeological record. Some part of them, quiet, diffuse, easy to overlook, appears to have continued on, inside descendants who never knew to look for them. The genome did not erase the old Arctic story. It reached underneath it and found an older, stranger one still intact. If there is a population whose history you think deserves this kind of look, a story where the evidence complicates more than it confirms, leave it in the comments. The human past is still being rewritten, one genome at a time.